Darius was enraged at the news of the Battle of Marathon and demanded more troops, horses, and ships than he had ever had before to be raised from all corners of the empire. The demands were so high that the Egyptians revolted, which of course made them the first target of this new, enormous army. While this was happening, though, the many sons of Darius were in dispute as to which of them would inherit the kingship and the empire. Since Darius was not born into royalty, but became king later in his life, there was a bit of a unique problem. Should his heir be the oldest of all of his sons, or should it be the eldest of those born after he became king? The eldest of this latter group, born after Darius became king, was named Xerxes. In addition to this, his claim included the fact that his mother was Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus, thus making him the grandson of King Cyrus the Great. Demaratus, the former king of Sparta, who knew a thing or two about inheritance issues, arrived in Susa in the midst of this dispute amongst the sons of Darius, and so he was able to counsel Xerxes as to how to strengthen his claim. King Darius was convinced by his son's case, and so declared Xerxes as the heir to his throne. He died soon after, leaving Xerxes with all of his unfinished military plans. Xerxes was ready to subdue Egypt, but didn't want to try conquering Greece at all. However, he was surrounded by people that lobbied him to do so, such as the Pisistrati and the Aleuti, that's former Athenian and Thessalian tyrant families, as well as a seer of theirs that recited all of the favorable oracles surrounding such an invasion, and none of the unfavorable ones that were also in abundance. However, the greatest of the lobbyists was his own cousin, named Mardonius, who we've already met. He secretly desired to become the governor of Greece. If the Athenians went unpunished, he said, others will feel much more comfortable challenging Persia as well. In addition, Europe was a particularly beautiful place where every kind of cultivated tree grew and the soil was excellent. It was a place, he said, which no one but the king of Persia ought to own. So Xerxes crushed the Egyptians and enslaved them like never before, then convened a meeting of the leading Persian nobles to make his intentions known. This is another of the great speeches from the Histories, so I'll include a good deal of it here. Men of Persia, I am introducing no new custom here. I am simply drawing on traditional Persian ways. As far as I can gather from our elders, there has never been a time when we have not been at war, ever since Cyrus deposed Astyages. It is the god who steers us in this direction, and so we prosper as we follow his guidance time and again. But what about me? When I became the king of Persia, I began to wonder how to avoid being left behind by those who preceded me in this position of honor, and how I might increase the Persian Empire just as much as they did. I intend to bridge the Hellespont and march an army through Europe and against Greece, so that I can make the Athenians pay for all that they have done to Persia and to my father. I will not rest until I have captured Athens and put it to the torch. The Athenians were the original aggressors against me and my father. First they marched against Sardis, along with our slave Aristagoras of Miletus. You all know what they did to us when we landed an army in their country. We will benefit from the enterprise in a number of ways. If we conquer them and their neighbors, we will make Persian territory end only at the sky, the domain of Zeus, so that the sun will not shine on any land beyond our borders. With your help, I will sweep through the whole of Europe and make all lands into a single land. Once we have eliminated those I have mentioned, there will be nobody left, no town or people capable of offering armed resistance. And so the innocent will bear the yoke of slavery along with those who have wronged us. But I don't want you thinking that I refuse to take anyone else's views into consideration, so the matter is open to debate. Please feel free to speak your mind. Master, you are the greatest Persian there has ever been. Particularly important was your promise not to let those despicable Ionians get away with making fools of us. We conquered the Sakai, the Indians, the Ethiopians, the Assyrians, and plenty of other important races, and we now hold them in slavery. Why? Not because they did us any wrong, but just because we wanted to increase our dominion. It would be a terrible thing, then, for us not to punish the unprovoked aggression of the Greeks. What do we have to fear? The number of troops they can muster? Their wealth and the power it gives them? No, we know how they fight, and we know that their power is limited. Who is going to threaten you with war when you come from Asia at the head of a massive army and with your whole fleet? I am sure that the Greeks are not so foolhardy. There Mardonius stopped. No one else had anything to say. Certainly, no one dared to voice an opinion contrary to the one before them. Until Artabanus, the son of Hystaspes, broke the silence, relying on the fact that he was Xerxes' uncle. My lord, unless opposing views are heard, it is impossible to pick and choose between various plans and decide which one is best. I told your father, my brother Darius, not to attack the Scythians, people with no established settlement anywhere, but he didn't listen to me. So he launched a campaign against them, and when he came back, he had lost a great many brave fighting men. But this campaign you're planning is against men who are vastly superior to the Scythians. There's danger involved. You say that you will bridge the Hellespont and march through Europe to Greece. Now, suppose you suffer defeat in a land or naval engagement, or even in both. These Greeks do have a reputation as fighters. The Athenians alone destroyed an army. Suppose they engage us at sea, defeat us, and then sail to the Hellespont and dismantle the bridge. That is where the danger lies, my lord. Disaster very nearly overwhelmed us once before under similar circumstances. If Histiaeus, the tyrant of Miletus, had gone along with all his fellow tyrants, that would have been the end of Persia. The whole of the king's affairs depended on a single man. You can see how the god blasts living things that are prominent, while small creatures don't irritate him at all. The god does not allow anyone but himself to feel pride. As for you, son of Gobryas, by disparaging the Greeks you encourage the king to march against them. I think that is exactly what all this effort of yours is for. Consider this proposal, Mardonius. While the king stays here in Persia, you pick your men. Take an army of any size you want and lead. Let us gamble the lives of our children on the outcome. I can tell you what news of Mardonius will reach those who stay behind here. They will be told that Mardonius was torn apart by dogs and birds somewhere in Athenian territory or somewhere in Lacedaemon. Remember, the king said, feel free to speak. It is only because you are my father's brother, Artabanus, that you are safe from the consequences of your insolence. But for your craven cowardice, I will humiliate you. You will stay here with the women. It is impossible for either side to withdraw. There is no middle ground in this war. Later, Xerxes thought better of his uncle's advice and called off the invasion. That night, according to the Persians, he dreamt of a tall figure approaching him and threatening him. Know this, if you do not go out on this campaign immediately, you have risen rapidly. You will be laid low again just as swiftly. He immediately summoned his uncle Artabanus for advice in the middle of the night. His uncle told him not to heed dreams, which he says do not come from the gods. The king is wise and has good ideas, but he is surrounded by bad men that lead him astray, he said. Xerxes insisted on a test first. He ordered his uncle to wear his royal clothes, sit on his throne, and then sleep in his bed, to see if the same dream came to him too. Artabanus was reluctant, but agreed. The same threatening figure appeared to him. So you're the one trying to discourage Xerxes from attacking Greece? You will not escape punishment for trying to deflect the inevitable. The figure then tried to burn his eyes with skewers before he woke in a fright and went again to his nephew. I tried to stop you because I am one who has in the past often seen mighty powers brought low by relative weaklings. I remember what happened to Cyrus's expedition against the Massagetai and to Cambyses' campaign against the Ethiopians, and I myself took part in Darius's attack on the Scythians. I was of the opinion that happiness for you lay in remaining peacefully at home. But since your impetuousness is God-given, it is my turn to back down. Preparations took 4 whole years. Herodotus calls this army the largest in all of human history, taken from every land in the Persian Empire. He takes plenty of time throughout Book 7 doing what I would describe as marveling at the enormity of both the army and the task at hand. This is definitely a significant characteristic of the epic mode that shapes his writing. The next several anecdotes are included to help exemplify his Homeric or epic treatment of this stage of the war. Herodotus will later make a conservative estimate that there were 2.7 million soldiers, with another 2.7 million support staff, making 5.4 million people, with an uncountable number of servants, concubines, cooks, and animals. Many of the rivers that this force encountered were completely dried up by all of those drinking from them. Xerxes took 3 years to build a giant canal to avoid Mount Athos, and then placed supply caches along the expected route to Greece. Once assembled, Xerxes accompanied his army as it began its long march. He sent demands to all the Greek cities, for earth and water, of course, along with instructions to be ready to provide meals for the king and his army when he arrived. While his engineers attempted to bridge the Hellespont, a storm destroyed their work. Xerxes responded by having the Hellespont lashed 300 times, and he had a pair of shackles sunk into the sea, and then had the water told to obey its master, him. The engineers themselves were beheaded. Later, Xerxes met the richest man in the world apart from himself, named Pythias, who offered to help finance the campaign. Xerxes accepted his money and his friendship. But then, later, Pythias asks a favor. Xerxes had promised to grant whatever Pythias would ask. But then, Pythias requested that one of his sons be spared military service and left home. "Damn you!" Xerxes replied in a rage. "Look at me! I am going in person to make war on Greece, and I am taking with me my sons, brothers, relatives, and friends. How dare you mention a son of yours when you are no more than my slave and should follow in my train with your whole household? Your hospitality will protect you and those 4 sons of yours, but you will pay with the life of the 5th son, the one you especially want to keep by your side." Xerxes found Pythias' eldest son, cut him in half, and marched his entire army between the 2 halves. Xerxes also encountered a beautiful plane tree, and ordered one of the 10,000 elite Persian soldiers, called the Immortals, to guard it. This episode inspired the musical aria Ombra Mai Fu from the opera Circe, or Xerxes, by George Frederick Handel. The army stops in the ruins of Troy. A thunderstorm off of Mount Ida, Zeus's retreat spot from the Iliad, killed many soldiers. Meanwhile, Xerxes walked the ruined palace of Priam and heard the story of all that had happened there long ago. Xerxes surveyed his forces at the Hellespont, land and sea, and though he was satisfied, he suddenly began to weep. His uncle Artabanus approached and asked him what was wrong. "I was reflecting on things, and it occurred to me how short the sum total of human life is, which made me feel compassion. Look at all these people, but not one of them will still be alive in 100 years' time." "That's not the saddest aspect of life," Artabanus replied. "It's not just that life is short, but also that there's no one on earth, including these men, whose happiness is such that he won't sometimes wish he were dead rather than alive. And this is a thought that occurs frequently during one's lifetime, not just once. We are so overwhelmed by tragic accidents and illness that, however short life actually is, it seems long. And this just goes to show how grudging the god is, because all we get is a taste of how sweet life may be." Let's hear no more about human life, Artabanus. You have described it well. We shouldn't talk about bad things when involved in good things, like our current project. Xerxes then asked his uncle his opinion about the expedition at this time. Artabanus shared that he was still afraid for the outcome, for the army's great size and strength was also its biggest weakness. There is no harbor in the world that could shelter the enormous fleet from a storm, and the huge army will only become harder to feed as it marches on, further and further away from Persian supplies. The longer it marched successfully, the more inclined the king and his commanders would be to continue marching right into this trap. In addition, part of the army was made up of Ionians, who Artabanus believed were likely to defect to the Greek side mid-battle. They'll either have to reduce their mother city to slavery, or help her win her freedom. Xerxes respectfully disagreed with these warnings. "You can see how powerful Persia has become. If those who ruled before me had shared your point of view, you'd never have seen our country make so much progress. What they did was run risks. That's what brought Persia to its current position of power. We are simply imitating them." With that, he sent Artabanus back to Susa, and reinvigorated his commanders. "The men we're attacking are valiant. If we get the better of them, there's no other human force that will resist us." Ships filled with grain sailed through the Hellespont on their way to Greece. Although his troops accosted them, Xerxes ordered them to be let go, reasoning that in the end, the grain will be eaten by Persians anyway. As the army crossed the Hellespont at last, a local man cried in dismay, "Why, Zeus, do you disguise yourself as a Persian man and take the name Xerxes? If you want to devastate Greece, why do you bring the whole of mankind with you, when you could do it yourself?" Xerxes saw a number of omens before him during this march that Herodotus believes foretold doom for the Persian army. However, on each occasion, Xerxes' magi told them that they meant the opposite of what they appeared to mean. Or, Xerxes himself considered them unimportant all on his own. Herodotus also describes for us in detail how many peoples were part of the army, their commanders, the number of troops in each one, and the names of the Persian high command. These were all men, with one exception: Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus. She will return later. Xerxes reviewed his army, then summoned Demaratus, former king of Sparta, who had come with him on the expedition. He asked whether the Greeks would stand and fight such a force as his or flee. Demaratus was careful. He first asked if Xerxes wanted a true answer or a comforting one, and then told the king that the Spartans, at least, will fight to the last man. Their courage is the result of intelligence and force of law, which they relied on to keep tyranny away, so they would never agree to any treaty that brought slavery to Greece, even if all the other Greeks joined Persia. Xerxes laughed out loud. How could 1,000 men, or 50,000 for that matter, when every man among them is as free as the next man, and they do not have a single leader, oppose an army the size of ours? If they had a single leader in the Persian mold, fear of him might make them excel themselves, and, urged on by the whip, they might attack a superior force, but all this is out of the question if they're allowed their freedom. Demaratus explained further. They're not entirely free. Their master is the law, and they're far more afraid of this than your men are of you. Xerxes was amused rather than angered. They continued on into Thrace. Herodotus tells us in passing that the Magi practiced the Persian custom of burying people alive as part of a sacrifice on this journey, and also that any town or village that had to host Xerxes' army was completely ruined by the visit. One meal for the king and all in his army could cost 400 years of a skilled laborer's wages, not to mention all the men that Xerxes picked up from each town to add to his army. Oddly enough, there's an analog to this in the modern day. Imagine a small town in any country has to host the Olympic Games. Preparation for these events is known to take a huge toll on a city's economy and on its people. Building new infrastructure, clearing space, and a myriad of other costs that I could only begin to guess at. Now imagine that at the end of the Olympic Games, half of the existing population in the city, not those who were visiting, but the permanent residents, had to leave. The army worked to cut a path through the mountains of Macedonia, and the heralds sent to the Greek cities all returned. Some had earth and water, and some did not. No heralds were sent to Sparta or Athens because Darius had done so before, and those messengers were, famously, thrown into wells and pits. Herodotus uses that story as a transition to what the Greeks were doing as Xerxes approached, going back in time a little bit. Many cities gave earth and water to avoid harm, because they knew there were not enough ships to fight the Persians, and simply for the purpose of remaining as bystanders in the conflict. Herodotus calls this eager cooperation with Persia. The Spartans, trying to placate the gods for their killing of Darius's heralds, sent 2 of their men as volunteers to go to Xerxes, offering their lives as recompense. And they did have to placate the gods because, you see, throwing the heralds in the pits, it was blasphemy, or madness in a way. Xerxes, however, magnanimously pardoned them and sent them home, despite their refusal to bow to him. On the way, the 2 Spartans were asked by one of the commanders why they didn't surrender. Xerxes would probably elevate them to be governors of the newly conquered Greece. They responded that no Persian could possibly understand, because they had all only ever been slaves. This recommendation of yours is not based on a balanced assessment of the situation. You have only half the picture. Although you know what it's like to be a slave, you've never experienced freedom, and you have no idea whether or not it's a pleasant state. If you had experienced it, you'd be advising us to wield not spears, but even battle axes in its defense. Herodotus then stops his narrative to give his controversial opinion, clearly marked as such. If the Athenians had fled, fallen, or surrendered to the Persians, no one else would have bothered fighting the Persians at sea, and so any land battles would not have led to lasting victory. Thus he extols the Athenians as the saviors of Greece, who held firm and rallied the rest of the country to push Xerxes back. The Athenians had sought advice from the oracle. The oracle's words ordered them to despair and to trust only in a wall of wood to save them. An Athenian named Themistocles convinced those present that this meant their ships, and that they needed to prepare a navy immediately, while ignoring the discouraging parts of the message. Themistocles will return later. Since the war with Aegina some years earlier, the Athenians had become experts in naval warfare and had a large fleet. They also met with leaders from all across Greece to advocate for laying their differences and their wars aside in order to face the existential threat of Persia. Most of them agreed, including the Aeginetans, their longtime rivals. The leadership was primarily divided between Athens and Sparta. Sparta commanded the army, and Athens the navy. Messengers were sent out to Argos, Crete, and Sicily for help, but no help came. Spies were then sent to observe the invading army at Sardis, but they were caught by Xerxes. Xerxes did not harm them, though. Instead, he gave them a guided tour of his entire army and navy before sending them back. Xerxes had guessed, correctly, that this would do more harm to the Greeks than killing the spies ever could. The land army had the task of trying to prevent the Persians from crossing into Greece through the mountains. The Greeks in Thessaly asked for help guarding the pass of Mount Olympus. An army was sent, but Alexander of Macedonia secretly sent a message telling them to leave and save themselves, for the army was going to get into Thessaly through his country, not by the pass that they were guarding. So that Greek army left, and when Xerxes arrived, Thessaly decided to collaborate with Persia wholeheartedly. The Greek forces then set their sights on the pass at Thermopylae, while the navy went to Artemisium at the tip of the island of Euboea, a similar choke point at sea. Both of these points could nullify the strategic value of the Persians' numbers and their cavalry. Herodotus estimates that the Persians had more than 3,000 ships with over 500,000 soldiers on them, not counting anyone that joined Xerxes on the way to Greece. As the Persian navy lay at anchor on their way down the coastline, an incredible storm hit. A very lucky few sailors that happened to be closest to shore beached their ships. The rest of them were hit. 400 Persian ships were destroyed, as well as plenty of supply vessels. The Persians still continued their approach, though much less confident than before. Meanwhile, Xerxes accompanied his land army to Malis, just north of the pass of Thermopylae. The Greeks assembled an advance guard of a little over 5,000 men from various corners of the country, with King Leonidas, the younger brother of the late King Cleomenes, in command. He had 300 picked Spartan soldiers with him. The other king, Leotychidus, who had replaced Demaratus in the last book, stayed back. Leonidas' advance was meant to deter any Greeks from joining the enemy and to rally the rest of the country to arms. Xerxes observed Leonidas and his men at the pass brushing their hair and exercising naked, which Demaratus explained was their practice when preparing for death. They would fight him fiercely, but if Xerxes could beat them and the rest of the Spartans, he would have nothing to fear for the rest of the campaign. Once again, Xerxes did not believe Demaratus' advice, and so he waited nearly a week for the Greeks to retreat out of fear. They did not. Furious now, Xerxes sent his soldiers into battle. The Medes rushed the Greek position and died in large numbers. They made it plain to everyone, however, and above all to the king himself, that although he had plenty of troops, he did not have many men. After a while, the Median place was taken by the Immortals. The result was no different, because the factors were the same. They were fighting in a restricted area, using spears which were shorter than those wielded by the Greeks, and could not take advantage of their numerical superiority. The Lacedaemonians made it quite clear that they were the experts, and that they were fighting against amateurs. Fear for his army made King Xerxes leap up from his seat 3 different times. Xerxes had no way to win until Ephialtes, from Malis, sold him information about a mountain path that circled the pass. Herodotus tells us that there are alternate accounts that it was somebody else who had told Xerxes about the path, but there's little evidence for it. It was Ephialtes who showed the Persians the way around the mountain along the path, and I hereby record his guilt. Ephialtes was murdered sometime after the war for reasons completely unrelated to it. This is a story that Herodotus promises to tell us, but never does. After learning about the path, Xerxes sent a contingent of soldiers with one of his high commanders to flank the Greeks. There was a small force of Greeks guarding the path, but they failed to keep the Persians away. Once news of this reached Leonidas and the main force of Greeks, many of them began to leave. Herodotus gives two accounts of why they left, either to save themselves or because Leonidas told them to go and save themselves, while he and his 300 elite troops could not abandon the posts they were responsible for. Herodotus inclines toward the latter. Some Greeks were said to have stayed even after being told to go. Leonidas kept the Thebans at the pass on purpose, though. They were brought there in the first place to be supervised, as they were suspected of collaborating with the enemy. The battle continued. Persians were now whipping their men to drive them into battle, and many of them died as the Greeks fought even more recklessly and fiercely than before. Just as many Persians got trampled by their fellows, or were pushed into the sea from the press of bodies fleeing the whip. The Greeks' spears, swords, and any other tools on hand were all used as weapons, and they all broke, but they kept fighting tooth and nail. Literally. 2 of Xerxes' brothers, as well as King Leonidas, died in the fighting. As the Persians began to gain the upper hand, the Thebans broke rank and joined Xerxes, though they took some friendly fire before the Persians realized who they were. The remaining Greeks were massacred to a man. Xerxes beheaded Leonidas' corpse and put it on a pike, which Herodotus says was very unusual for Persians to do. Demaratus was summoned once again. Things turned out exactly as you said they would. How many Lacedaemonians are there left? Are they all that good? My lord, there are about 8,000 men in the city of Sparta. All of them are the equals of the ones who fought here. Xerxes asked for advice in dealing with these warriors in the easiest way possible. Demaratus suggested occupying an island off the coast of Sparta. Doing this would prevent the Spartans from acting in defense of the rest of Greece. If Xerxes did not do this, however, Demaratus said that the Spartans would be even more trouble than before. Xerxes would have listened to this advice, but his brother Achaemenes was listening in. He stepped forward and denounced Demaratus, essentially just for being Greek. Surely he can't be trusted, he says, and he envies Xerxes' success. No. Instead, come up with a plan that serves your own interests well, without taking the enemy's side of things into consideration. Without thinking about where they're going to wage war, what they'll do, and how many of them there are. They can be left to worry about their own business while we do the same with ours. Xerxes chose to follow this advice instead, but still trusted Demaratus and did not punish him. Herodotus tells us that he had heard one account claiming that when Xerxes announced his intention to invade Greece, Demaratus had sent a message to Sparta, warning them. This message was carved into wood and then covered up with wax, with an innocuous message carved into the wax. Gorgo, the wife of Leonidas, was the one who figured out what it meant, and told the rest of the Greeks about the invasion. Book 7 is the culmination of many of the ideas we have seen at work throughout the Histories. First, consider the events, large and small, that led to the events of Book 7. The feud between Aegina and Athens, described in Book 5, started because of a stolen statue. It leads to war between the two, but this sets in motion the deposition of Demaratus and the help that he gives to Xerxes to become the king of Persia. But it also causes the Athenians to build their navy that will be used to repel Xerxes, ultimately. Gorgo, Leonidas' wife, not only decoded a message that warned about Xerxes' invasion, but she's also credited by Herodotus for preventing Cleomenes, her father, from joining in the Ionian revolt. Who knows how that would have gone differently if they had joined in. Speaking of Cleomenes, if we take Herodotus at his word that the king's insanity was a result of his bad actions, then the deposition of Demaratus also caused Leonidas to become king of Sparta, just in time for the war. Herodotus spends a lot of time telling us about the various tyrants kicked out of Athens, which seems tangential until those same tyrants end up being the ones lobbying Xerxes to invade. As interesting as these causes are, though, the much more impressive observation made by Herodotus over the course of the Histories is the ideological causes of the war and its outcome. Consider the various aspects of the Persian ethos we have observed over time. Xerxes' speech to his commanders, as well as to his uncle Artabanus later on, acknowledges the long Persian tradition of war. He observed that this is how their empire became great, and equates being the equal of his predecessors with how much land he is able to conquer. We know the stories of Cyrus, of Cambyses, and of Darius, so we know exactly how Xerxes got that idea. Xerxes follows the precedent of Persian kingship closely. If Cyrus or Darius had followed advice to be cautious, they would never have become great, Xerxes says. He's right. There was no hint of caution in any of their campaigns. Darius did not listen to Artabanus in Scythia either. It's not just the king, though. As Artabanus says, the king is surrounded by people with selfish motivations who will push him toward the course of action that they think will give them the most power, even if they don't think it's best. Lies for profit remains the established precedent for getting things done in Persia, apparently. How did all these terrible people get here? Did Xerxes just happen to be surrounded by bad advisors at this critical moment in time? No. This situation has been brewing for generations. How many men have come to Persia seeking to expand, secure, or regain a tyranny? Hippias, Pisistratus, the Aleuadae, Histiaeus, and the Paeonian brothers to start. Every time Persia conquered a new territory, a satrap, that's a governor, was put in charge of it. We've seen this happen. This was certainly an expected outcome by the Persian nobles from every single conquest. And that's what Herodotus tells us that Mardonius' motivation was for encouraging Xerxes to attack Greece. The throne of the Persian king has been the place to go looking for a share of power for decades. However, that's not enough to produce this current situation either. We know the power of the Persian monarch over the lives of everyone in his empire, and now, apparently, it's dangerous to contradict him once he's chosen a course of action. Even if he invites advice and says you are free to speak, no matter if you are his uncle or his greatest benefactor. Not to mention that if you try to dissuade the king from his course of action nicely, you will still be stopped by the nobles that surround him. They don't want to share the king's high regard. This happens with Demaratus, whose great idea to flank the Spartans and thus immobilize them was quickly rebuffed by Achaemenes, who gives some laughably bad advice instead, for fear that Xerxes would be won over to Demaratus' suggestion. This is opposition to dialogue, opposition to the Logos. So now let's look at all of the ingredients that have produced this current situation. The king of Persia understands success as equivalent to conquering other countries and enslaving other people, and advice as agreement. His selfish nobles understand his conquests as an opportunity for them, while the others usually know to keep their mouths shut. Xerxes is also used to the idea that his subjects are slaves. Living in Persia, then, he has met few, if any, free men. I must again draw attention to Dewald's insight regarding the tendency of powerful men to ignore the limitations the world has placed on their power, and in particular to fail to hear information that would be useful, but does not fit their own notions of the scope of personal control over events. We now have a very good idea of how Xerxes' notion of the scope of his power was formed. Xerxes' blindness to useful information is observed on no less than 4 occasions that we've touched on already. Twice in conversation with his uncle Artabanus, and also twice with Demaratus. The conversations with Artabanus reveal to us that there are other lessons Xerxes could have gleaned from the Persians' history. Every one of the kings met disaster or near disaster in the exact same way. And there may be many Persians that are aware of that, but their voices are not valued in this monarchy. They are slaves, and only Artabanus has immunity from the consequences of speaking out. In any case, he points to the long history of overconfident kings that failed to appreciate X factors that could throw an entire campaign into disarray. Or really, a long history of Solon's mantra being lived out on the geopolitical scene. Demaratus' discourse regarding the men of Sparta tells him directly what this X factor is for Greece: freedom and the force of law. This, unlike the previous point, is something misunderstood in this book by both Persia's kings and its citizens alike. Freedom is a major theme throughout the histories, but especially in Book 7. The 2 Spartans sent to die explain to the Persians that they stay with that if you haven't been free, you cannot understand it. And if you have, you'll do anything to preserve it. Demaratus says much the same thing, with one addition. They're not entirely free. Their master is the law, and they're far more afraid of this than your men are of you. Besides having kings, the Spartans had ephors and assemblymen that all contributed to the constitution, the laws, and the decisions. Xerxes says in response that he can only imagine men willing to fight a superior force if they had a master whipping them on, and does not believe that freedom would be a benefit in this regard. Fittingly, these two visions of freedom for the human person play out against each other on the battlefield at Thermopylae. Xerxes has his soldiers whipped into battle against the superior force, you could say, and many of them are trampled to death or pushed into the sea. Meanwhile, Leonidas allows many men to flee for their lives once the path around the pass is discovered, and it's reported that many of them decided to stay anyway, willing to die to protect the freedom of the rest of the Greeks. Herodotus believes that the prowess of the Greeks at Thermopylae is as much the result of this freedom as it is the Spartans' superior training. The other piece of information that Xerxes ignores from his uncle is the problems associated with the size of his army and navy. Herodotus draws our attention to many of his previous themes that are woven into this problem. The self-regulation of the world against those that are too great, proud, or powerful, once they inevitably overextend themselves. The usual way this is foreshadowed is when an army crosses a body of water that marks a boundary. However, in Xerxes' case, it's much more obvious. He literally whips the Hellespont and tries to shackle it and berates it for not submitting to him. Prior to the campaign, Artabanus warns that you can see how the god blasts living things that are prominent, while small creatures don't irritate him at all. Herodotus appears to associate freedom with small, autonomous peoples, city-states, for example, while associating slavery with giantism. Similar to freedom, the thematic differences between Xerxes' point of view and Herodotus' ideal become visible in the events of Book 7. In the case of both Thermopylae and the terrible storm off the coast of Greece, Persia's army and navy suffer because of their great power, not in spite of it. They are not overpowered by a superior force. They collapse under their own weight. In both cases, the land, the world, is the force that curbs the power of Xerxes' army. Herodotus' portrayal of the Athenians in Book 7 definitely reveals his admiration for the choices that they made during this critical time. However, he's not pro-Athenian to the exclusion of the other Greeks. His view of Athens as the savior of Greece, and even the leading city in Greece, does not prevent him from extolling Leonidas and the Spartans. In past books, he's put forward the idea of Athens and Sparta being complementary to one another, which is seen here in how they split the command of the army and the navy. There are many more examples of this to come in the last two books that we should be on the lookout for, too. Since he's writing during the Peloponnesian War, I wonder if Herodotus hopes to inspire the current warring Greeks of his day to imitate their fathers, who were capable of cooperation and doing amazing things when they worked together. Thank you so much for watching. Please join me next week for Book 8.